You're listening to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast, a place for sex addicts to share their experiences of recovery, to help break the stigma, myths, and misconceptions of sex addiction. This podcast may contain topics of sexuality, sexual trauma, dysfunction, or other things that may be triggering, so listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. My name is Jason, I'm a sex addict, and I will be your podcast host for today. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to episode number 71 of the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. This week, I will be sharing another installment of Joe and Charlie, The Big Book Comes Alive, and this will be finishing their segment on the resentments inventory. And before getting to that recording and the reading for this week, I wanted to mention a couple of things. One of the reasons why I decided to take the week off last week from recording a full-length episode was because of my wedding anniversary this past weekend and had a wonderful time. It was nice just to have a week where I could be present and not have to worry about editing and posting a podcast episode. I did, however, put out a short episode talking about the upcoming Serenity on the Sound retreat, which is put on by the Puget Sound Retreat Committee. And I also got an email this week from my friend Jackson in the Noon groups, and he wanted me to post a reminder about an upcoming fall retreat in Orange County, and this is an in-person retreat. And I'll have the full details for that at the end of this episode, but it will be Saturday, October 22nd, in person in Irvine, California. And like I mentioned before, I will have all the details for that at the end of this episode. Turning now to the reading for this week, one of the things that Joe and Charlie brought up in this recording is from a story at the end of the AA book on page 551, and this comes from the story Freedom from Bondage. And there was a particular section in that, which is actually on page 552, that I wanted to read here at the beginning of the episode. And they will have fuller context about this quote here, but it says, "If you have a resentment you want to be free of, if you will pray for the person or thing that you resent, you will be free. If you will ask in prayer for everything you want for yourself to be given to them, you will be free. Ask for their health, their prosperity, their happiness, and you will be free. Even when you don't really want it for them, and your prayers are only words, and you don't mean it, go ahead and do it anyway. Do it every day for 2 weeks, and you will find you have come to mean it and want it for them. And you will realize that where you used to feel bitterness and resentment and hatred, you will now feel compassionate, understanding, and love." And my sponsor actually had me do that for a particularly hard resentment that I had against a former supervisor. So anyway, in this section of the recording, they're finishing the columns 4 and 5. And I've seen 4 and 5 be combined into one column. So if you look at a lot of forums online, if you're searching for a review of resentments grid, often it's referred to as column 4, what's my part in it, or where was I to blame. So they do break it down into what, if anything, did I do to set this in motion? And then the other side being, what is the exact nature of my wrong? So this picks up the following day on the AA event where this was recorded. And I have skipped through a couple of their icebreaker jokes that they made towards the beginning to lighten the mood before getting back into the thick of the fourth step. And where this recording ends for this episode, they were just making the segue into fears, and I thought that I would cut it off right at the end of the resentments part. So anyway, I am really excited to share this final installment of the resentments. Here is Joe and Charlie, The Big Book Comes Alive. I hope you enjoy it.
Okay, we finished up yesterday evening. We were in the process of talking about our inventory process. Joe, let's put it on the screen for just a moment. We made our list of resentments, and we found out how many resentments we really did have. Most of us didn't think we had very many, and we start putting them all down on paper for the first time. We realize how many resentments we really do have. And if we've got that many resentments, then God can't direct our thinking because the resentments direct our thinking. Column 2, we put down the cause of the resentment. And as we filled out that second column, we begin to realize it's not really them we're mad at. It's what they've done that's got us upset. And begins to get kind of names out of the picture. And we start centering in on what they did to us rather than who they are. Column 3, we put down the part of self that was affected. And we found that in most cases we'd be one part of self is really going to stand out as we fill out that third column. One person may be writing in self-esteem all the time. Another one may be security. Another one it may be sex. With most of us it'll be a combination of all three. But at least one part of self's going to stand out and show us the part of self we're having a real problem with. Column 3, we also found out the source of our anger. We found that we cannot get upset unless somebody threatens one of the basic instincts of life. And if they threaten our social instinct, security instinct, or sex instinct in any way, then we usually react with anger and resentment, etc. And we never could do anything about anger because we didn't know where it came from. But now that we know it comes from a threat to one of the basic instincts of life, then with God's help, maybe we don't have to react with anger all the time. And we're in much less chance of getting drunk than we were before we started this thing. We also found in the book that the resentments are an absolute waste of time. Because when they're churning around in our head, we're pretty well paralyzed from doing anything worthwhile. All we want to do is just sit there and turn that resentment over and over and over and over, replaying what they did to us and replaying how we're going to get even with them and how we're going to show them, and etc. And for most of us, we wasted thousands and thousands of hours in resentments and really can't see whether they did us any good at all. So that was a bad thing, the absolute waste of time. But we also found that wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing is that a resentment blocks us off from the sunlight of the Spirit. And blocked off from God, we don't feel good. And if we don't feel good, then sooner or later we start thinking about taking a drink. Next thing you know, we become insane. And we take a drink and we trigger the allergy and we end up drunk over and over and over again. Resentments are the number one offender. We turn back to that list because it held the key to the future. And for the first time, we begin to realize that other people have really controlled and dominated our thinking for us as far back as we can remember. And we always thought that we had it, that nobody told us what to do, and we didn't need anybody's advice. But we begin to realize that other people, through our resentments toward them, have actually controlled and dominated our thinking for years and years and years. With that came the realization that some of these people are already dead and buried in the graveyard, and reaching out from the grave and had us by the yang-yang as far back as we can remember. And we saw that began to look pretty stupid. And we fancy ourselves as reasonably intelligent people. We don't like to look stupid. And we see the stupidity behind these resentments. We see that it's letting other people control us and dominate our lives for us. It begins to look so dumb that those resentments that did look awful good in our head now begin to look pretty stupid on paper. And we don't like to look dumb. We don't like to look stupid. So about 95% of those resentments automatically begin to disappear when we see the stupidity behind them. But there are also going to be probably 3 or 4 or 5 resentments that have been embedded in our minds so long and so deeply that just seeing the stupidity behind them don't get rid of them. And the book recognizes now in every action step that self cannot overcome self. that in every action step we're going to have God's help. So we now come to the first prayer in the big book on step 4. We hear always about the step 3 prayers, the step 7 prayers. We never hear about the step 4 prayers. So let's look and see how we can get rid of those that are so deeply embedded that they don't automatically leave when we see their stupidity behind them. Joe?
He said this was our course. We realized that the people who had wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick.
And we're at the bottom of page 66.
Though we did not like their symptoms and the way they disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. Here's the first part of the prayer. We ask God to help us to show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, this is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry, thy will be done. See, I used to lay awake nights like most people thinking about these people and how I was going to get even with them and how I could get even with them. Never could get even with them. But I finally found out how you get even with people. The way you get even with people is you pray for them, you see? And when you pray for them, then you're even. And I did that. But I had some deep-seated resentments, too, that didn't quite work like this. And I was in Apache, Oklahoma one time. I was sober about 4 or 5 months. And I met this lady named Alabama Carruthers. Some of you all may have heard of Alabama. She's dead now, bless her heart. But she loved Alcoholics Anonymous, and she loved this program dearly. And she was speaking there that night. And she said a couple of things that kind of went off like a thunderbolt in my head. One of them said she had a soul sickness. And boy, soul sickness. Now that's what I finally heard a word I could put with the feeling that I had in the last days of my drinking, a soul sickness. And then she said another thing. She said, I've got peace of mind tonight. Peace of mind. God, I thought to myself, how long has it been since I've had peace of mind? Could not remember. And after the meeting was over with, we were sitting around this hotel, and my little friend George was laid over in her lap asleep. He'd sleep in your lap, too, if you got a chance. But that's George. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, I said, Alabama, you said you had peace of mind tonight. How did you get peace of mind? And she said, well, Joe, tell me what's going on in your mind. See, I never told anybody that. Because I think they would think I was crazy if they knew what was going on in my mind. And I told them about my old Rose there. And when I drank, back in those days, I drank and I'd go places. And I didn't come home right away either. Sometimes I'd be gone overnight or 2 or 3 days or a week or a month or whatever. And I'd come home just like I just went up to the store to get a loaf of bread. You know, thought no more of it than that. But this one time I'd been gone about 3 months. And I was sitting at the bar one night called the Zebra Lounge. It's a lovely place. And
still smell it today.
Almost smell it now. But I was sitting on the bar stool and I got to thinking. Now you know either drink or think, but don't get the two of them mixed up. I got to thinking, well, old Rose hadn't seen me in about 3 months. I bet she's lonely. Wouldn't you be if you hadn't seen me in about 3 months? And I said, I think I'll go home and visit. Anybody know what I mean by visit? Okay. So I'm going to go home and visit. So I went over to my house and I banged on the door. And she kind of peeked out the door a little bit. And I just broke right in there is what I did. And got in my living room. And there's sitting an old boy in my recliner. Watching my TV. In my house. With my wife. And I'm making payments on all that. But what are you going to do, Jim? I did. I jumped on that old boy, and he liked to beat me to death on my own living room floor. Put me out in the yard and told me not to ever come back. Boy, you think I didn't live on that one for a long time. And I told Alabama about that. I told her how my mind used to race all the time thinking about that situation. How can I get even with those people? And she said, well, Joe, you're just full of resentments. And I said, well, what is a resentment? She said, resentments are old angers and old hurts that are refelt over and over and over again. And all that anger you intend to use on them, you're turning it on yourself. You're making yourself sick and blaming it on them. And she had to explain that to me several times before I finally got it. And I said, well, is there any solution for this? What can I do about this? Now, you have to know Alabama. She had a purse about that big and about that tall. And she began to dig down in that purse. You know how they are. And she was looking for something. She finally found this book down there. And she pulled it out. And she said, Joe, on page 551 of this book, in the Freedom from Bondage section is a story of a lady who had some deep-seated resentments like you do. And if you read and do what she said and did, maybe it would help you. She said it had helped her, maybe it would help me. So she showed me on page 551 in the third paragraph. This lady said, I've had many spiritual experiences since I've been in the program. Many that I didn't recognize right away, for I'm slow to learn. They take many guises. But one was so outstanding that I like to pass it on whenever I can, and I hope it would help someone else as it helped me. As I said earlier, self-pity, resentment were my constant companions, and my inventory began to look like a 33-year diary, for I seemed to have a resentment against everybody I'd ever known. All but one responded to the treatment suggested in the steps immediately, but this one posed a problem, and it was against my mother, and it was 25 years old. I had fed it, fanned it, and nurtured it as one might a delicate child, and it had become as much a part of me as my breathing. It had provided me with my excuses for my lack of education, my marital failures, personal failures, inadequacies, and of course my alcoholism. And though I really thought I'd been willing to part with it now, I knew I was reluctant to let it go. If it did all that thing for me, I'd be reluctant to let it go too. But one morning, however, I realized I had to get rid of it before my reprieve was running out. And if I didn't get rid of it, I was going to get drunk, and I didn't want to get drunk anymore. In my prayers that morning, I asked God to point out to me some way to be free of this resentment. During the day, a friend of mine brought me some magazines to take to a hospital group I was interested in. And I looked through them, and a banner across the front of one featured an article by a prominent clergyman in which I caught the word resentment. Now, he said in effect, and here it is, if you have a resentment you want to be free of, if you will pray for the person or thing that you resent, you will be free. If you will ask in prayer for everything you want for yourself to be given to them, you will be free. Ask for their health, their prosperity, their happiness, and you will be free. Even when you really don't want it for them and your prayers are only words and you don't mean it, go ahead and do it anyway. Do it every day for 2 weeks, and you'll find you've come to mean it and want it for them. And you'll realize that where you used to feel bitterness and resentment and hatred, you now feel compassion, understanding, and love. Well, I went home after that conference and got in bed that night. My mind started racing again. And I remembered, I said, I think I'll pray for those people. And I prayed for them, added some names to the list. Next morning I got up and I said, I think I'll pray for those people. And I prayed for them and some other people. And as the days went by, it seemed like I was in constant prayer for weeks, 2 or 3 weeks or 4, I don't know how long, all day long. But I do know this, one morning at the corner of 31st and Lewis in Tulsa, Oklahoma, after one of our cold winters, and I guess it was in early April, I got stuck in a stoplight. And I looked over there at this beautiful home sitting on the corner. Now, this was just the length of a stoplight. I noticed those tulips were red and yellow, full bloom. They were just gorgeous. The grass was green, and the birds were singing, and the trees were blooming out. And so, boy, I said to myself, it's a beautiful morning, isn't it? Absolutely a beautiful morning. And then I said to myself, well, Joe, how long has it been since you've seen a morning like this? I could not remember. I could not remember. See, I've been looking in black and white for so long. There was no color in my life. But that morning, everything was vivid. And I knew that morning was the morning that this program would work for me. You see, I prayed for those people. They didn't change. But I did. And my feelings toward them did. And then I realized I wasn't laying awake nights thinking about them either. You see, we were even. I was even with them because I prayed for them. And this book talks about being cut off in the sunlight of the Spirit. I know what that means. I mean, I really do know what that means. And I don't ever want to go back there again, ever. Thank God for the program of Alcoholics Anonymous.
If you've got a resentment that you don't want to get rid of, for God's sake, don't pray about it. Because if you do, it's probably going to disappear. You know, I had one of those against a guy, and another one of those that I would gladly have killed him if I could get by with it. I got to that part of the recovery program, and I told my sponsor, I said, I said, I can't get rid of this resentment. And he said, why? And I explained it to him, and he said, oh, Charlie, said, you've got to get rid of that resentment. That if you don't, sooner or later it's going to get you drunk. And in my usual smart mouth manner, I said, okay, how in the hell do I do that? And he took me to this page in the book that Joe just read. And he said, now go home and do what it says. And you'll be okay. You'll get rid of that thing. And I went home and got down on my knees, which again I very seldom did in those days. And I said, God, I want you to give that son of a bitch everything he deserves. And that's the only prayer I had for him that day. And the next day I prayed again, and the next day I prayed again, and 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days later, I don't know how long, I found myself saying something I didn't intend to say. I found myself saying, God, give him in his life what I want in my own. Give him the same peace of mind and serenity and happiness that I seek for myself. And 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 days later, I don't know when, one morning I woke up and that resentment was gone. Never, never to return. And the irony in the whole situation is it wasn't 2 months, and this guy moved in as my next door neighbor. And we were allowed to visit back and forth again in each other's homes, and eventually we became good friends again. This thing really does work. I think the reason it works so good is prayer for the welfare, for the benefit of another human being, is one of the great expressions of love that one human being can have for another. And love and hate can't exist on the same plane. One's going to have to replace the other. And as we pray for their prosperity and their welfare, do it every day for 2 weeks. If it don't work, do it 2 more weeks. And if that don't work, do it 2 more weeks. And eventually, those kind of resentments are going to disappear also. Now just think, if 95% of the resentments disappear because they look so stupid, if the other 5% can be removed through prayer, then that means this display cases up here in my little store that were filled with resentments have now been emptied out. They've now been emptied out. The damaged and unsaleable goods called resentments are gone. And when that happens, there's another natural law that applies. And that law is that nature abhors a vacuum. No such thing as a vacuum or a void. There's always something rushing in to fill it up. If those resentments disappear, God's not going to leave another hole in my head. I got enough of those already. If they disappear, they're going to have to be replaced with something else. And the only thing that can possibly replace them will be the opposite of the resentment. And where my mind used to be filled with resentments, now then that part of it is filled with love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill toward my fellow man. You know, that's God's thinking. And I found out to my amazement that to get love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill, I didn't have to go to any other fellowships, and I didn't have to read any other books. If God dwells within me, and my book says that he does, then those things have always been a part of my makeup. I just never could use them before. In my chase for money, power, prestige, sex, all what I thought were the good things of life, the love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill had to be repressed to let me operate on the level I wanted to operate on. But now that the resentments are gone, they automatically come to the surface. The most amazing thing that I've ever seen actually takes place. A third of my mind now, I'm in much less chance of drinking. We don't have to wait till we get to the end of this thing to get something out of it. If resentments have been replaced by love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill, then I'm beginning to get a little peace of mind, a little serenity, and a little happiness all at the same time. You know, this thing really does work. It always amazes me when it does. Now, it would do no good, though, for me to get rid of those resentments if I didn't know how to keep them from coming back. Because the world's full of sick people, and they're going to do it to me again tomorrow. And if I'm not careful, I'll resent. And I can't have just one resentment. If I get one, if I don't do something about it, the next thing you know, I've got 2. And then I've got 4, and then I've got 8, and then I've got 16, and then I'm a basket case all over again. So we need to do one more thing. Let's go to page 67. And now let's look at the last 2 columns on that inventory sheet. On page 67, the middle paragraph down the middle of the page, it says, referring to our list again. You see, this is why you've got to have a written inventory. This is the second time we've had to go back and refer to that list again. If you had a mental inventory, you would have lost it already. Referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. We've always looked to see what those suckers did to us. We've never looked to see about our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly, and were willing to set these matters straight. So I go back to the inventory sheet, and I look at column 4. And if you'll notice, column 4 is headed up, what did I do? Putting out of mind the wrongs others had done, I resolutely looked for my own mistakes. What did I do, if anything, to set in motion trains of circumstances which in turn caused people or institutions to hurt me and eventually led to my resentment of them for doing so? So I went to that first name on my sheet, that lady named Barbara. And I said, okay, Charlie, now let's do what your book's telling you to do. You forget what Barbara did. You forget about her filing for divorce 3 times in that 1 year. What did you do, if anything, to set this thing in motion? And it took me about 5 seconds. And I said, if I hadn't been out there screwing around, I wouldn't have got caught. Joe calls that committing adultery. I just call it screwing around. I wouldn't have got caught, and she probably wouldn't have filed for divorce in the first place. Another 5 seconds. If I hadn't been sneaking around behind her back lying to her all the time, she probably wouldn't have filed for divorce in the first place. Another 5 seconds. If I hadn't been blowing all of our money on what I thought was important, paying no attention to what my wife and kids actually needed, she might not file for divorce in the first place. And for the first time, I began to realize why I loved resentments. You see, I can play a resentment over and over and over and over in my head. And every time I play it over and over in my head, I distort the picture just a little bit every time. And every time I distort the picture, I made what she did a little worse, and what I did a little bit less. And let me play it over long enough, I'm finally able to transfer all blame to Barbara and make myself just as pure as the driven snow. You know, I don't think we alcoholics could live with ourselves when we're out there doing our thing if we didn't have the ability to transfer blame to others. The guilt and remorse eats us up bad enough. But if we had to actually see the truth behind the things that we're doing when we're out there drinking, you know, I don't think we could possibly stand it. So with these resentments, we can play them over and over and over and gradually transfer blame to others and never have to look at ourselves and go on and live the kind of life we're wanting to live. I said, my God, is there any more like this on here? I looked at the Internal Revenue Service. Hated those people with a purple passion. I said, now forget the fact they're trying to put you in jail. What did you do, if anything, to set this thing in motion? Very simple. If I hadn't have cheated on my income tax, they wouldn't have been trying to put me in jail. And rather than admit that I'm a liar and a thief and a cheat, I play that resentment over and over and over in my head, transfer all blame to them, make myself as pure as the driven snow. Joe with old Rose. Same kind of thing. Joe, what did you do, if anything, to set that little deal in motion? Committing adultery, he said. Did you do any lying to her? Yeah, lots of lying to her. Did you hear what he said? Always spending their money trying to impress people he didn't like in the first place, Typical alcoholic. And what we do with those resentments, we play them over and over and over in our head, gradually transfer blame to others, make ourselves as pure as the driven snow, and then keep right on living the same kind of life we wanted to live. And we men go from woman to woman to woman. You ladies go from man to man to man. We go from job to job to job. We go from city to city to city and state to state to state, and it's always their damn fault. I think that fourth column is one of the most revealing things that any of us can do for ourselves, to look to see the part that we played in this thing. If we didn't play any part in it, if they did it to us and we didn't do anything to set it in motion, in column 4, we just put nothing. But in most cases, in my case, every one, I didn't have a resentment that I had not done something to set that thing in motion, created a problem for them, then they retaliated against me, and then I resented and played it over and over, transferred all blame to them. The book also says, where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? And we've added one more to that, inconsiderate, because we're going to use it in a couple pages anyhow. And that lists the character defects talked about in the big book. Character defects are selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate. So we go into the 5th column now. And this little deal with Barbara, where I was out there doing my thing, paying no attention to her and the kids and etc. Was I selfish under those conditions? You better bet I was. Was I dishonest? You bet I was. Was I self-seeking and frightened? Oh yeah, I was saying to myself, man, you're getting close to 40 years old. If you're going to say we're going to get some of that, you better get out there and do it now before you get too old. Fear drives us to do many things we would not normally do. Was I inconsiderate of my wife and children? You bet I was. If I really considered their needs and wants first, ahead of my own, I wouldn't have been out doing those things. I looked at the Internal Revenue Service. Cheating on my income tax, was I selfish? Sure I was. Was I dishonest? Sure I was. Was I self-seeking and frightened? Sure I was. Afraid I wasn't going to have enough money to do what I wanted to do, so I ended up trying to cheat them out of their money. And how about Joe with Rose? Was Joe selfish? Yeah. Was Joe dishonest? Yeah. Was Joe self-seeking and frightened? Yeah. Was he inconsiderate? Yeah, if he really considered old Rose, he wouldn't be gone 2 or 3 months at a time. He wouldn't come home and find some boy sitting in his easy chair if he stayed home once in a while. So for the first time, we look in that 5th column, and we see the type of personality that we have developed through our life of living, or through our living life run on self-will throughout our entire lifetime. And I didn't like what I saw. I always thought that I was a pretty good guy. I just drank a little too much. But when I looked into that 5th column and I saw how selfish I had really become, and how dishonest, and how self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate, I began to realize for the first time, if I stay that way, then I'm going to keep right on doing the same old things I've always done. And if I keep right on doing the same old things I've always done, I'm going to continue to hurt people and institutions. And they're going to retaliate, and I'm going to resent, and I'm going to end up drunk over it. I begin to see in the fifth column where I'm going to have to start changing some of those things if I want a little peace of mind, serenity, and happiness in the future. Just think, if I could become a little less selfish, I'll never be perfect, but if I could become a little less selfish, if I could become a little less dishonest, if I could become a little less self-seeking frightened, if I could become a little less inconsiderate, then maybe I wouldn't be doing those things that's going to hurt people and institutions. And then they wouldn't have to retaliate, and then I wouldn't have to resent. At the very least, I'm going to have to do something about that fifth column. And really, that's the whole purpose of this inventory, is to get me to that fifth column. Column 1, we got to have it, and column 2, and column 3, and column 4. But the whole purpose of those 4 columns is for me to see in that last column, column 5, the character defects that I have developed through living a life run on self-will. And those are the things we'll have to work on. Now, we're in the process of taking step 4. We'll put a little 4 up here at the top of that sheet. This is the inventory part, the resentment part of it. In the 5th column, we now see the exact nature of the wrong that we're going to talk to another human being about in step 5. The resentment is the wrong. That's what blocks me from God. But what's the exact nature of it? And the exact nature of something is what is at the core of it. What's the inherent characteristic of it? So we're going to talk about that in step 5. A guy comes to me today with his step 4 to do a step 5. I don't care how many times he's stolen, whether he's stolen twice or 200. What I'm interested in is what's within him that causes him to steal. Does he do it because of plain dishonesty? Does he do it because he's self-seeking frightened? Does he do it because he's inconsiderate? That's what we got to find out. I don't care how many times he's committed adultery, whether it's 10 or 100. What I'm interested in is what's within him that causes him to do that. Those are the things we'll work on. That's what we talk about in step 5. The whole purpose of this inventory is to get us into that 5th column. Also in the 5th column, we now see the character defects that we're going to become willing to turn loose of in step 6. Knowing full well if I don't turn loose of those things, if I stay that way, then I'm not going to get a bit better. Also in the 5th column, I now see the shortcomings. I'm going to ask God to take away in step 7. And in my case, all the names in column 1. In your case, some of them. In my case, all of them are going to be taken off column 1 and added to the sheet to be used later on for steps 8 and 9. When we get to 8 and 9, the book says we have the list. We made it when we took step 4. Now, we didn't really realize we had hurt all those people until we worked our way all the way across the inventory sheet and found out we'd been using resentments in order to transfer blame to them. And we didn't realize we had hurt them until we finished up this particular part of the inventory. The most amazing thing I've ever seen. And it's just that simple. And it doesn't take very long to do this either. You can do this thing in a matter of 2 or 3 hours. Hell, I see people doing this, trying to do this in a matter of 2 or 3 months. Now, we can do it in just 2 or 3 hours. Just follow the simple little instructions. Joe, you got anything else there? Okay. Now, we don't want to try to give you the impression that you can always be 100% free of resentments. God never gave us anything bad. It's only what we do with it that determines whether we're bad or not. A resentment, if used correctly, can be used for a worthwhile purpose. For instance, if somebody does something to me that threatens my self-esteem, if it causes me to look at me and see some changes I need to make, and I go ahead and make those changes in my personality, then the resentment was used for a worthwhile thing. But if I just keep letting it fester and fester and fester and blaming them for doing so, then it's going to make me sicker and sicker and sicker. Give you a good example. Let's say we're living in the neighborhood and all the old houses are in bad shape. They all need painting. They've all got broken window panes and torn window screens. My house is no worse than anybody else's, and I'm very complacent about that situation. I go home from work in the evening, I sit on my front porch, and I rock, and I rock, and I rock, and I enjoy life. One day I look up and some idiot has moved in across the street. Yeah, he's out there painting his house, fixing the window screens and window panes. Makes my house look bad. And I resent the hell out of him for doing that. I say, who in the hell is he moving in here screwing up the whole neighborhood? If I use that resentment right, it'll cause me to look at my house and become a little bit ashamed of it. Next thing you know, I paint my house and fix the window screens and the window panes. My next door neighbor resents me for doing so. Next thing you know, he's cleaned up his house. After a while, God's got the whole neighborhood cleaned up like it should have been in the first place. But we alcoholics won't use it that way. We'll sit there and we'll resent, and 30 days later at midnight, we'll go over and burn his damn house down. We'll say, One more little thing on resentments, and then we're going to leave them alone. I hear some of you saying, and I hear good, I really do. I hear some of you saying, well, Charlie, this is probably all true for people that we ourselves have harmed. How about those that hurt us and we didn't have anything to do with that? You know, how about the mental abuse and the physical abuse and the sexual abuse that we experienced as kids growing up? How about all those things, abusive things that happened to us in our marriages? Aren't we justified in having that kind of resentment? I guess we are, if we want to get drunk over it. But you see, a justified resentment does the same thing an unjustified resentment does. It blocks you off from the sunlight of the Spirit. And it'll get you drunk just as fast as an unjustified resentment will get you drunk. Whoever or whatever we're resenting, they're controlling our thinking, justified or unjustified. Now, it really doesn't make any sense to let somebody hurt us 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, and then let them continue to hurt us every day for the rest of our life. Because every time we play that thing over, we experience that pain again, over and over and over and over and over and over, and we've given those people the power to actually kill us. Not only did they hurt us, but through our resentments, we're giving them the power to actually kill us. And if we've got one of those kind of resentments, we better get it down on this sheet of paper. Who are they? Column 1. What did they do? Column 2. Which part of self affected? Column 3. What did I do, if anything? Column 4. Nothing. But then let's look into the 5th column. Let's look into the 5th column. Are we using that resentment to rationalize and justify things? The lady in the book did it. She used this resentment against her mother to justify her lack of education. Bull. The greatest excuse in the world is, I could have gotten an education if Mother hadn't have done that to me back there when I was a little kid. Bull. If she wanted an education, she could get it. She used it to justify her marital failure. Bull. Mama didn't have anything to do with that. She even used it to justify her alcoholism. Bull. I'll tell you why she became alcoholic. she kept on drinking whiskey. The greatest excuse in the world is if they hadn't have done that to me, then I wouldn't have to do these things I'm doing. Or if they hadn't have done that to me, then I would be able to do these things out here. We call that rationalization or justification. I think the new name for it is victimization. We don't have any room in AA for victimization. You know, we're trying to get some peace of mind, serenity, and happiness. And as long as those old resentments are rolling around in our head, we're never going to have peace of mind, serenity, and happiness. And the only way we can get rid of those things, the only way we can live free is to get rid of those things. Now, if we look at them and see the truth, and see the stupidity of letting them control our life and hurt us every day, many times they will automatically disappear. If they don't automatically disappear, then we've always got the recourse of praying for them. The hardest thing in the world to do is to pray for another human being who has hurt you badly. But that doesn't mean we approve of what they did. That doesn't mean we're going to walk hand in hand with them the rest of our life. What it means is we're tired of letting sick people make us sick. And they are sick people. They're not necessarily bad people. They would have done it to anybody in that situation. And if we can even begin to realize that, we can begin to get rid of those kind of resentments also, until we can become resentment-free, at least to the level that God intended for us to do.
Such a great recording, and I have mentioned that I use this in my own step work as well as with my sponsees, and especially the prayer, "This is a sick man, how may I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry, thy will be done." And when we go through the 5th step portion of this, I'll have my sponsees either write out this prayer for each person or say this prayer for each person as we review our resentments. And similarly, I've done this with a few of my sponsees, and my sponsor had me do this as well. The section on page 551 from the big book, praying for someone for 2 weeks. As difficult as it may seem, that really helped me turn the corner on some of my hardest resentments that I had. So yeah, really grateful for this recording. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, that I'll be sharing the fears portion on another upcoming episode. I think the work that they've done here with the 4th step is really, really helpful, and I'm hoping that other people are getting something out of this as well. So back to the email that I got, and this is from Jackson. Like I mentioned, he is in the noon groups. "Hey Jason, you probably get asked to spread the word about a lot, but I'd sure appreciate if you'd mention this in-person retreat either on the podcast or during the noon Zoom meeting." And definitely, and I wanted to put this out in time to get the word out that this is coming up Saturday, October 22nd, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. in Irvine, California. And if you want to register for this, I will put the link in the show notes for the episode, but this is put on by the Orange County Intergroup of SAA, and their website is OCISAA.org. and then /upcoming-retreat for further information about this retreat. The price for admission for this is $20. So if you are interested, please check out the link that I provide in the show notes. Coming out of my wonderful anniversary weekend, I have not scheduled any upcoming interviews for the podcast, and we'll be working on that in the future. The past couple weeks have been really busy, and it's so bizarre that I've got something going on pretty much every weekend since the middle of September. So it's been really busy here. And I know from last year, Once I started getting into the holidays, November and December, it became really, really hard to keep up with the podcast. So I will be putting out fewer episodes of the podcast towards the end of this year, but I will continue to do what I can to schedule new recordings. If you want to be a guest on a future episode of the podcast, you can always email me at jason@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. And if you wanted to provide any feedback for the podcast, you can do that at feedback@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. So I am looking forward to being at the Zoom retreat coming up this weekend. And so I'm doing as much as I can to get this episode out towards the beginning of the week. Thank you so much for tuning into this one. And as always, keep coming back. The views and opinions contained in the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bay Area Intergroup or the ISO of SAA.